Hi everyone, it's James Martin, co-founder and former co-host of What's Left. I hope that you're all keeping well. I'm presently recovering after some medical procedures and I'm in a place with no Wi-Fi, otherwise I would have been joining you this evening. And this evening's show is a very special one. It really is about, and certainly I'm sure as you get into the show you'll appreciate why I'm saying this, but it's a story that has inspired me throughout my life, as it's a story that combines trade unionism and equalities. And if you're familiar perhaps with some of the names that will be discussed this evening, you won't be a few mentions away from a superb film called Pride. Pride is a superb watch if you haven't seen it. However, please note that this is a film. There is a genuine story that sits behind it, and that story really tops what already is an excellent film. But the story is something that we should certainly know about a little bit more in our movement, and the story crosses the oceans and the planet essentially, with lessons for us to learn, or at least reinforce, as you understand what went on. Now, it's not for me to really do an interview on behalf of a group called LGSM, but really just for me to say what an absolute privilege it is to have LGSM. And I'm sure as we get on with the show, what LGSM is, where it is today perhaps, will be discussed. But I just thought I'd say hello, miss you all, and enjoy your evening. Bye now. When I said, hey, hey, what's wrong, man, I want to turn you round tonight just to see you smile. You don't gotta be there, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Hello, I'm George White, and I'd like to introduce the What's Left co-hosts, Renee Barnett.
Hi, everyone.
And Sean Halsall.
Hi, everyone. How are you all doing?
Not so bad.
Well, I'm excited.
So tonight we've got a guest on, Mike Jackson, who's the LGSM secretary.
Hiya, Mike.
Hi.
Hiya, Mike.
Hey, Mike.
Hiya.
Welcome. Could maybe we should start by just explaining what LGSM was and is.
Some witch recently said, so the acronym LGSM, what does that stand for? Let's go sell merchandise. So it truly stands for Lesbians and Gay Support the Miners. It's about something that happened 39 years ago in the British miners' strike, which was probably the second biggest industrial dispute in British labour history, second only to the general strike of 1926. And the major players were Margaret Thatcher, boo, and Arthur Scargill, who was the miners' leader, general secretary of the miners' union, and I swear that he is the best trade union leader that the Britons have ever had before. Categorically, he's a fantastic trade union leader. And what Thatcher did was she was attempting to starve the miners back to work. The Tories have always been very good at using tactics like threatening people's lives. And she sequestered the funds of the union. So the members of the union had not only paid their union subscriptions to the functioning of the union, But included in that was a strike fund, so that if they ever went on strike, and obviously when you go on strike, you don't get your wages paid anymore, they would have a little bit of money to help get them by whilst they were on strike. And Thatcher just came along and sequestered the lot. Yeah, whether that was legal, who knows? But governments, especially Tory governments, seem to be able to do whatever they want to do. And so basically that left the miners absolutely zero money to live on. It meant the union had zero money to function with. And so what the union said to people around the world, because it truly was that global support, was that if you supported the miners, do not send any money to the union, because the government will simply seize it, and instead twin with individual mining communities. Now, if you've seen Pride the movie, it varies tremendously from that story. We have no problem with the fictional elements to the movie. It's a movie, that's what movies do. But in fact, there was no point. It wasn't that the union shunned LGSM's money. The union shunned everybody's money because it was pointless taking that money. And so that's what that was about.
Oh, I see. So that's what really happened.
Yeah.
On what
sequestration. If there were working class people doing this, it'd be called robbery.
Absolutely.
But because it's the ruling class doing it, it's called sequestration.
On what grounds did they claim to sequestrate, Mike? What were the supposed breach?
Oh, well, you can go on and on and on with like this kind of stuff. Yes, there was a supposed breach of I can't remember exactly what the excuse was, but there'd been some fine imposed on the union for being naughty. And it's an irrelevance really what it was. Yeah, in the same way that the ongoing still bane is there wasn't a national ballot for the strike. Yeah, and it's a bit of a shame that there wasn't a national ballot for the strike. Would it have made any difference? None whatsoever. And arguably there had actually been a ballot of all the branches of the union. It's a federation, is the NUM, and so they'd all agreed to go on strike if it came to pit closures. So in a sense there had been agreement, but not as one national body. Yeah. And the people's naivety to think that would have made any difference. Do you know what I mean? This was class war. It was out and out earnest class war. And all brakes are off. All legal things are off. Do you know what I mean? So the government just marauds in, sequestering the union's assets and trying to start people back to work. It also stopped paying benefits to single miners who were on strike. So that cuts off their money supply. All very, very deliberately orchestrated. Before the miners' strike, 8 years before the miners' strike, which started in March 1984, there was a Labour government in power, a few times in British history when the Tories were not in power. And whilst the Tories were out of power, they had this shadow minister. Rennie, you may not. Do you have the term shadow minister?
No, but believe me, I'm kind of an Anglophile, so I know quite a bit.
Yeah, well, for your
more
listeners,
than the average American, I'll say. I hang around with a lot of Brits. Two of them are on screen with me right now.
For other listeners, shadow means you're in opposition. So
yes,
there's the employment minister, and there's a shadow employment minister who's not actually a real minister, but he's the one in opposition. Anyway, this shadow minister called Nicholas Ridley had been sent off to do a little report for the Conservative Party about what they would do when they next got into power, particularly with the trade unions. And it's available to read. And it was written in about 1977, 8 years or so before the miners' strike. And it's really chilling reading. The miners' strike was so meticulously planned by the Tories. and all kinds of things that they would militarize the police. They would cut off the money supply to the strikers. They preempted it all. And of course, we were powerless really to do anything about that, other than the knowledge that would happen. And it was leaked at the time. I'm afraid I was too young and inexperienced to have noticed something like that. And it does puzzle me really why the movement didn't really take heed of that when it was leaked in about 1978, 79. Yeah.
I think they claimed as well that it was not accurate. It was a exaggeration or a fabrication. The idea of closing the pits and everything, and then subsequently in the sort of the 30-year release of information rules, it came out that it was exactly true. It was totally genuine.
Yeah. The Tories claimed that 20,000 miners were going to be made redundant. I think it was. Now I can't remember the exact figures, but Arthur Scargill said that was a pack of lies, and he said the numbers. And as you quite rightly said there, George, 30 years later, when government papers were declassified, it turns out that Thatcher and the Tories were lying, and Arthur Scargill was right. And another lie that the Tories tried to spin was that the miners' strike was a dispute between the miners and their employers, the coal board. Well, that takes some imagination. For a start, the coal board was the state. It was not a privatized industry. It belonged to the government. Yeah, so the government were the direct employers. But they pretended that and they're doing it again right now in Britain. They pretended that really it's nothing to do with them. It's an industrial dispute, and that's up to both parties to sort out. Absolute nonsense. And again, those government papers that were declassified, you can actually see in Margaret Thatcher's personal handwriting marginal notes on the cabinet minutes where she's micromanaging the strike, working out the numbers of scab lorries that will be used to move coal, because the good old railway workers were absolutely in solidarity with the miners, and not a single lump of coal was moved by the railways during the strike. The Tories had to find hundreds, probably thousands of scab lorry drivers and scab lorry companies that would move the coal. And there's Margaret Thatcher just micromanaging all of this. You can see it in the side notes, as I say, of the cabinet papers. Yeah.
A little bit earlier, Mike, you mentioned class war, and it's a really interesting sort of phrase to me, because if anyone on our political side of the fence uses that sort of them words, it's you're a militant lunatic and you're living in a imaginary land, when I think class war is something that's being done to working class people for the last 30, 40, 50 years now, where it's completely acceptable for them to take away safety nets, to sort of attack the NHS, destroy education. We're seeing now, we're in a state in this country where kids are going to school not knowing the roof's going to come in. It's absolutely bonkers. But the minute anyone on our side starts talking about class war, it's red under the bed territory, and we're all lunatics. We should be afraid of it. It's interesting that sort of terminology. I mean, I'm completely comfortable owning my politics, but it's
The thing is, what we know is it's their job to do that. It's their job to denigrate us in every which way that they can, whether it's true or false, whether it's a lie. It's absolutely irrelevant. It's really important that they denigrate the left, because we have class consciousness, and because we do believe in class politics. And the only thing that the ruling class have to do is to make sure that everybody else is not simultaneously looking at them. Because if we all, at the same time, around the world, all look at them and say, this is all your fault.
Yeah.
And that's it. Game's up. Done. Job done. So it's really important for the ruling class to constantly keep spinning lies and distractions, to put blame on other people. And I mean, we know that, you know, I know it personally because, you know, the LGBT community was used in that regard in Britain, still is with the recent stuff about trans people, and in places like Russia. The LGBT community is being decried again, and it, you know,
what about in the United States of America?
Yeah.
It's
how
really
pathetic is that?
Crazy.
Choose something that will always be a minority group, no matter
Yes.
what country and what stage in history. We will always be a minority group. So it makes it very difficult for us to fight back on our own, and just smear us, just tell lies about us and other us. You know, what spineless people these are. Do you know what I mean? These people are just unbelievably evil. Anyway, we managed to turn that around, and that's what this podcast is about.
Absolutely.
Just with that, Mike, as well, just the sort of going back to the idea that you know, the divide and conquer, the othering bit, but the idea that somehow the smaller sections are all separate, when in reality they're all part of the working class. It ought not to be, and it shouldn't be. That there's sort of bite-sized chunks that the ruling class can knock off one by one, because if we all stand together, they can't. You know, just the mathematics of it. There's lots of us. There's a very few of them, isn't there?
Well, I mean, I think that's what the whole Jeremy Corbyn thing was about. And it wasn't just about Britain. The global capitalist elite was watching what was happening, watching Jeremy Corbyn's tremendous public appeal. The only politician who could walk into a city, literally and more or less, and stand on a soapbox with only a few hours' notice or a day or two's notice, and thousands of people would flock to hear him speaking live. That must have been the envy of every politician around the world. It must have also bloody well frightened the life out of them that there is that much feeling. You know, they constantly tweaking their knobs. I always think of, you know, it's like mad scientists keep tweaking the knobs to make sure we're all divided and we're all looking the wrong way and that. And then suddenly one man comes along and changes all that, and millions of people just go, that's what we want. Well, that must have just frightened the ruling elites around the world, frightened them to death. And so they use everything in their power to discredit him. Didn't have to be truthful or honest or whatever. And, you know, there might not be a lot of these people, but they have an enormous amount of power because they've got most of the money in the world. And that's why they made this determined effort to destroy him. Which
as far as I can see, they've installed a Tory in disguise in Keir Starmer. You know, they couldn't be more different.
Yeah. I mean, it's not really worth wasting our breath over Starmer, really. You know, and they keep, you know, I like the way that the right wing keep using words like this word "modernise." That is such a euphemism. Modernize actually means completely opposite. It means go back to almost primitive dog eat dog, you know, rugged individualism. Society doesn't exist. Community doesn't exist. Democracy is a bit of a nuisance, really. You know, it should all be just like savages out there, like dogs going around. Do you know what I mean? That's just unbelievable. And to believe that Keir Starmer has anything to contribute is just a madness. They are pink versions of the Tories. The Tory party, I'm sure, are quite glad that Keir Starmer exists and Blair exists and Mandelson exists, because they're like the default party. If the Tories lose, at least we get the pink Tories in, which is what Keir Starmer, etc., is. They represent nothing that would help ordinary people, and they've reneged on almost every single promise that they made. Yeah.
And the sort of the sort of fetishization of the individual, because I don't believe that human beings are designed to work that way. I don't believe that it's the natural state of human beings to be, it's all about me and I'll fight everybody else for what we've got. I think it is the natural state of human beings to socialize, to be with each other, to share, to live in common. I think that is the natural state of the species. I think it's them who are wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think humans. You hear this all the time. Oh, people are greedy. I don't think humans get to where we are if greed's the sort of default position. It is sharing and looking after each other. That's how we've survived for most of the human condition to get to where we are. But just moving forward a bit, Mark Ashton, he was a real inspiration to a lot of people in the movement. Communist and fellow traveller with many people in the trade union movement. What was it like working with him back in the day?
He was really good fun, was Mark. I look back and just think how young we all were. Mark would have been about 24 years old at the time of LGSM. I was 29 going on 30. I was one of the older ones. And Mark, it's a surprising journey Mark went on, really, because he wasn't brought up in any way politically. A lot of people on the left, in my experience, often come from families that are left or whatever, but not so with Mark. As a young teenager, he was into dance and clubbing and fashion and stuff like that, like a little baby gay that he was. And had no interest in politics. And another reason possibly for that was the fact that he actually was growing up in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So politics there was extremely dangerous, and most people were frightened and didn't raise their voice too much because you just didn't know what was going to happen. So you really didn't get mixed up in political struggle in Northern Ireland then. But his father fitted second-hand textile machinery. I suppose Britain's cotton mills were closing in the 1960s and 70s and early 80s. And a lot of the machinery was still workable, but it was just redundant. And so his father went around the world fitting these huge textile machines in other parts of the world. And he'd got a contract doing this in Bangladesh, and he invited Mark to go out and see him. And we all really think now that it was that experience that switched the light on in Mark's head. Because, of course, he grew up in a northern working class town, so there was quite a lot of poverty as there was in my childhood around. But, of course, the poverty in Bangladesh was a different league completely. To see children homeless begging on the streets and people with disabilities begging on the streets where there were no welfare benefits, there was no universal health care or whatever. And I think this really shocked Mark, and he came back and he just got into politics. I regret never really having a thorough conversation with him about this, because by the time I met him, which was probably only about 3 years later, he was a complete communist firebrand, incredibly knowledgeable. He'd learnt so much, and during the LGSM time, actually progressed to becoming the General Secretary of the Young Communist League. I'd be careful not to over-egg that much, because probably the total membership of the youth group of the Young Communist League nationally wasn't very high. It's a very grand title, but nevertheless, that's what he became, and quite rightly so as well. Do you know what I mean? Because he had put an awful lot of effort into into learning the history of the labour movement and socialism and Marxism, etc.
Yeah. Were all the so when you were founding LGSM, was everybody coming from a political side, or was it a hodgepodge of all sorts?
That's a good question. So because the miners' strike was such a huge thing, some people have described it as a civil war without guns. You know, you were either pro-miner or against the miners. And because it was such a big thing and it was on the television news every night, it drew in a lot of people who'd never been involved in politics before. And of course, the established left of whatever persuasion were, you know, they could smell young blood, as it were. Do you know what I mean? And they were all over it, you know, trying to recruit people and so forth. And that was reflected in LGSM. So we had, obviously, the majority of the people who were attracted to LGSM were already political people. So we have people from Socialist Action, Socialist Workers' Party, Communist Party, the New Communist Party. We had one anarcho-syndicalist, which impressed me a lot because there's so many syllables there. I had no fucking idea what anarcho-syndicalist was, but it sounded cool. Anarchists, people like me who weren't politically aligned but were, you know, socialists. And as I say, people who were absolutely new to politics, who were involved because for them it wasn't a class thing and it wasn't a labour trade union movement thing. It was just natural justice. They just thought that the miners were being treated really in a shit way. It was just not just. And that'll do. Doesn't matter where people are coming from, as long as you get them and you all work together. And there was some political jostling. It always reminds me of kind of men bearing the chest. You know what I mean? The different political parties trying to recruit people, and it did get a bit tedious for some people, including me, to be honest. And Mark and I both got concerned about that, and basically we proposed a motion, and LGSM only had 2 motions ever, because that wasn't the point of the group, to have motions. But one of these motions was simply LGSM is open to anybody from what we would now refer to as the LGBT plus community, who supports the miners' strike, and our job is to raise funds for the striking miners, and to kind of publicize all the facts about the strike. And that was it. So, and that was good because the group grew so quickly, so exponentially, that even the different factions of the left quickly just dropped everything, because everybody knew we were onto something really good here, and it was far too precious to fuck up by, you know, getting into factional arguments and so on. And for newcomers, it bores the life out of them because they don't know what you're talking about. You know what I mean? It's like, you know, the bread and butter thing is, let's get on the streets, let's defend the miners, let's collect money for the miners, and fight for them, which is kind of what we did. Yeah.
Imagine what the left could achieve if we all just stopped the committees and motions in this country and just got on with the basics. It'd be incredible to see.
Yeah. Well, you know, Sean,
well, I suppose that's the thing about action, isn't it? It's when stuff's happening, that's when the real change comes, and you can't necessarily always predict when that will happen. It obviously is more likely to happen through things like strikes, but it could happen through almost any event, really. And it's about being savvy enough, wise enough to react to that event and to see the potential of it. Yeah.
So what was it like seeing yourself being portrayed by someone else on screen, Mike?
It's a question a lot of people ask, and it's certainly a question I would have asked, but now I've actually been in a position where it was. And when you think about it, you'd be a very odd person if you had an idea of how people perceive you beyond a kind of generic, well, I'd like to think people thought I was a nice bloke, you know, as all four of us would, you know, but you don't really kind of think much more about what you come over like to other people. You'd be a very, very odd person if you did. So I'm not the person to judge whether he portrayed me accurately or not, but my family and my friends are, and they all went spot on, yeah. And he's a good looking tall fella as well, so I didn't have any argument with that bit.
So what was there time spent to learn your behaviours and your characteristics, or?
Yeah. So Joe Gilgan, who plays me, came round to the flat and spent 45 minutes with me and Stephen Beresford, the writer. The odd thing was, a few days prior to that, I'd been introduced to Ben Schnetzer, who was the American actor who played Mark Ashton. He was unaccompanied by Stephen Beresford. Ben Schnetzer and I were just left to it. And in fact, I spent a day with Ben because obviously Mark was no longer here for Ben to kind of meet. So he was pumping me for information about Mark. Now, Ben, it was interesting. Ben's a very, very studious actor. And I just said to Stephen Beresford afterwards, I said, I find it a bit curious that you let Ben Schnetzer loose on me and we spend a day together unchaperoned, and I have 45 minutes with Joe Gilgan and you're sat present. And he said, yeah, well, I know you like a drink. I know Joe's a stoner. I'm not going to leave you two until after this movie's released. Once it's released, you can do what you want, but until it's released, I'm keeping my eyes on you lot. And I think that's quite right. I understand that. But yeah, I mean, it was great. And I mean, obviously, having a movie made about your life, it is amazing. And I learned so much about the industry. I mean, my background, my job, I'm retired now, but my job was horticulture. And it's hard to think of something more remote from the movie industry than gardening. Do you know what I mean? So I learned a lot about the movie industry, how it all works. I went on 3 shoots. I went on one of the Gays Award shoots. I went on the Pits and Perverts ballroom scene shoot, and another one I can't quite remember now. Yeah, and it was interesting how. So the Pits and Perverts one, they have a CGI person who's wandering around with a little, not a laptop, tablet, because they have 200 extras, but those 200 extras have to give the effect of 1,500 crowd people. So they keep stopping, getting to put different clothes on, and then regrouping, and then he has to kind of merge. It's really clever how it's all done. The Gays Award shoots, they couldn't actually use Gays Award bookshop, which is still going, by the way. It would have been too expensive, and I don't think Gays Award would have wanted to be closed down for that length of time. So they found an old derelict shop in northwest London somewhere, and it was really interesting to watch them turn a street from the year 2011 into the year 1984. So they do tricks like put litter bins over modern parking meters, litter bins that you would have had in the 1980s, and all kind of tricks like that. The yellow lines on the road, they wouldn't have been there, so they get a tipper lorry to come in and they drop all this grey gravel. So it's very clever all that, how it all works, that stuff. Yeah.
Do you think, Mike, with sort of how divided the country and politics has come in Great Britain and America, do you think a group like LGSM could sort of get their act together today if they were forming and sort of come around to support, like say, the train workers at the moment? Do you think there'd be too much opposition from sort of far right actors and that sort of stuff?
Oh God, that's it's. I'm going to rule that one out of order because it's like an ahistorical question, really. I mean, it whatever happens now is going to be different to almost 40 years ago. I mean, for example, I suppose a lot of young people, not necessarily LGBT people, might wonder why we formed an LGBT support group for the miners. Do you know what I mean? Because today that wouldn't seem to be necessary. Because, for example, the trade unions are there as vanguards of LGBT equality. But of course, they weren't 40 years ago. They were pretty hostile to women, to black and brown faces, and to queer people. And so we coalesced as LGBT activists precisely because we needed to support one another in fighting homophobia. And we had no problem with fighting homophobia because that was the only way we were going to change the world. But what we did need is each other for support, in case you're attacked either physically or verbally. So I'm not really answering your question. I appreciate that, Sean, but I'm quite optimistic very optimistic, in fact, about young activists today. They do things in a completely different way that we do. They've learnt from things that we did, as we ourselves learned from our predecessors. They've taken the baton and run with it. Some of the really positive stuff, they're far more inclusive than we ever were. They automatically just include people in a way that we never thought to. And especially the really younger generation, the teenagers and the people under 25, say, they're also much more inclusive about their politics. They link everything together. They can link the miners' strike to gender equality, to colonialism. They're making all those links, which again must terrify the right wing, because the right wing's job is to confuse people about all that stuff and certainly not make connections like that. Dear me, to suggest that the British Empire was a despicable, awful history of colonization, slavery, torture, murder, concentration camps, etc. That's actually what British history has been, and this country's should hold its head in shame in that respect, or at least this country's ruling class should hold its head in shame. Because that same ruling class immiserated my ancestors. My ancestors were miners. They were weavers. I come originally from Lancashire, where cotton weaving was a big thing. And I'm old enough to remember in my childhood the conditions that we grew up in, and they were filthy because of the industrial grime. The air was really polluted. It was a pretty grim way to grow up. But it was the 1960s. Things already were changing. There was light appearing. You had that kind of first, I suppose, the beat culture of the 1950s and 60s. You had the pill, so women had a huge emancipation there. In the 1960s and 70s, we were making great headway with wages. The unions were powerful and strong and winning good pay for people. And you had a younger generation, under 25, who got money in their pocket and they could go out and buy fancy clothes and vinyl records and so forth. That had never happened previously. So it was an interesting period for me as a youngster, because it was the tail end of kind of Victorian industrialism. and it was the beginning of a kind of this newer modern world. And in Britain, of course, in 1945, we had a Labour landslide, and the Attlee government that introduced all kinds of amazing things for advancing the British working class around housing, education, the introduction of the National Health Service, of course, welfare benefits, from, they used to say, from cradle to the grave, you will be looked after by the states, and that was fantastic. And that lasted nearly 30 years, and the person who came along to systematically destroy that was Margaret Thatcher. She started it off in Britain, and then really it rippled all around the world. She started off in Britain in what you might call the democratic culture. The first person who really started that wave was Pinochet in Chile, but he introduced that new economic wave by being a murderous dictator and assassinating the trade unionists and the socialists in the National Football Stadium. Thatcher couldn't quite do it as brutally as that, but she was a personal admirer and friend of General Pinochet of Chile. That just shows you what kind of monster she really was. Yeah,
and then went on to protect him from extradition when he came over to have his operation as well.
And that was just down the road from where I live. It was just so frustrating. I so wanted to break in and say, you scoundrel. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, the American right is, seems to have a really cruel streak in it. While they, are supported heavily by the evangelical community of Christians who claim to, follow Jesus Christ and do what Jesus did, which was, of course, take care of the poor and the sick and all that, but yet they do the opposite. But I've been hearing more and more, that cruelty is the key. Cruelty is the point. That's what they're trying to do. They're just trying to be as cruel as possible. Do you feel like that's what Thatcher? I mean, do you feel like she recognized it all, the cruelty of what she was doing? Because over here, Margaret Thatcher was just like, oh, they've got a lady in a high position. That's really cool.
Well, that's what the American propaganda machine made you think.
That's right.
It wasn't true. Yeah, because she famously said there is no such thing as society. There are families. What was it? Families and individuals. Yeah. Now that's a really chilling thing. That's quite fascistic. That, because to deny there is such a thing as society means a denial of collective help. And we early on in this program said actually us four believe that human beings are naturally tribal. We naturally look after each other. That's how we operate as a species, and some of our closest biological relatives, it's the same thing. But the Tories don't like that idea. They like individualism, and you can see why, because they deny class exists too rightly, because if you accept that class exists, then you have to work out that there actually is a ruling class and they need to be destroyed, and they don't like that. And that's it. That the essential difference between us and them is we believe in collectivism. We don't believe in big leaders. I mentioned that I thought Arthur Scargill was the best trade union Britain's ever had. I think I can say that factually without adoring him or venerating him
exactly.
As special. That's just an event, and that Arthur Scargill became who he became because of events and people and history that led to him being who he was, his influences. So, I do not believe that Jeff Bezos is an outstanding, amazing human being. He's just can I swear? He's just fucking rich. That's all he is. He's just fucking rich. Jeff Bezos is nothing. The reason Amazon is a successful company is because of the logistics and the technology that Amazon uses, and they use the very best and very latest of human technology. That technology was never invented by Jeff Bezos. That technology has come from hundreds of years of people working by brain or by brawn, to develop technology and computers and AI and so forth. And it's the hundreds of thousands of inventors and scientists and engineers that have produced Jeff Bezos's empire, not Jeff Bezos. It's the fruit of all that labor that's happened before.
And
Jeff Bezos is nothing.
And the idea as well that they sort of put across that I did it all by myself. In order, for example, for Amazon to even exist, it requires a healthy workforce to be there. So it requires some kind of healthcare system.
Right.
It requires workers that can, comprehend the task that they have. Literacy, numeracy. It requires an education system. It requires the wagons to go about and deliver the stuff and the vans. So it relies on all these things that tax pays for, that society pays for, and then they choose to pretend like they're headquartered somewhere that they're not, or pretend that the transaction happens on the World Wide Web, so it doesn't happen in the UK or it doesn't happen in America. It happens in some third-party tax haven type country. And then the idea that, I did it all by myself, whilst allowing everybody else to pay for those things that you require for your business to function.
It's even
and
more.
Elon Musk. I mean, they're all that way,
Yeah.
It's even crazier than that, because it's, aside from the tax and stuff, Jeff Bezos never made a penny. It's the workers who do the labor, delivering the stuff, parceling it, running around picking. The business model at Amazon is designed to break their workers. They're just seen as robots. Once they're done, we'll find another worker to put in the place. We'll underpay them. We'll get them relying on universal credit or state benefits to feed and clothe themselves, put a roof over their heads. It's Bezos, Elon Musk. None of these people have ever made a penny. They've stolen money from the people who do the labor for them. It's
Yeah.
Taylor's all.
But of course, where will that all end? Because the one group of people we've not talked about there is the actual end consumer. The end consumer is us. The end consumer are the workers, the people who've got money in their pocket. Mm-hmm. And if we carry on being completely irresponsible about society in that Thatcherite sense, then we could end up with a system where AI runs everything and nobody's working anymore. How does that system work? It's mad. You can't have Amazon unless you've got millions and millions and millions of customers. Do you know what I mean? Unless the super rich think that by being in their little club and swapping multi-million-pound oil paintings with each other will somehow work. Well, it won't, actually. I've got news to you, because farming, you can't it's a very limited ability to do AI with farming and so forth. We need workers, we need food, we need that's iron ore and blah blah blah.
That's the contradiction of it all, isn't it? It's these businesses who are trying to automate and AI everyone out of existence, out of a job, out of the workplace. Who's left to buy the shit at the end of this? Who's left to consume the nonsense that we're all producing? It's just no one's thought that far ahead by all accounts. It's just madness to me.
Yeah, well, it is an insane system. It's a very dangerous, unstable system. I mean, it's always quite miraculous, really, how capitalism does survive, because it's a completely insane economy, and it's an insane way of organizing a society. It really is. And with climate change, we've got now introduced a factor that's never existed before. Nothing as serious as climate change has ever existed before, and that, as Naomi Klein said, that does change absolutely everything. And governments are putting their head in the sand and they're lying to us. You know, they're saying that they're doing stuff, but they're not, and they're not doing enough. I did a bit of research, you know, because I've worked in land-based industry all my life. When global warming was first mooted, it was about 1975, and I was a student of horticulture then. And I thought, my God, this is amazing. This must be really bad, because they'd try and hide something like that if they possibly could. But it must be so widespread that it's undeniable. That was 1975. I then did a bit of further research in it. There was a press cutting from a New Zealand newspaper, 1911. Same thing, global warming due to carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And I did further research, and I got back to something like 1860. So we've known about the deleterious effects of pumping all this carbon into the atmosphere since the 1860s. Nothing's been done about it. Why? Because there's a profit to be made.
And sort of pretty early on in the use of carbon as well. It was pretty early on in the, you know, probably only, you know, in a big fashion, perhaps 60, 70, 80 years on from when they were starting to, you know, use steam to power things. It wasn't long after then if they cottoned on that early on.
Yeah. But it was a great age of scientific discovery, wasn't it? So, you know, they'd be questing for all that stuff. Yeah.
Just we've only got a few minutes left, Mike. I just wanted to ask, what was it like the first time you walked into that welfare hall in Wales?
Well, that's another scene where it was very, very different to what you see in the movie. Yeah. It's now become so. There's that wonderful shoot in the movie where the telephone call rings in the miners' welfare hall, and Gwen, the character, walks over to the phone and answers it. Beautiful bit of cinema, completely untrue. What it actually was a letter that I wrote, and I remember posting the letter thinking, God, I'd love to be a fly on the wall when that letter's opened in South Wales. And it's only in recent years we've found out the detail of what happened. They met weekly on Sundays, which LGSM did as well in London. And the weekly correspondence was read out. And when my letter was read out to them, there was some remarks. All the men, you know, only the men made some remarks, and there's a few titters and giggles and so forth. And the women just rounded on the men, basically. They're generally tough women in mining communities. It's a brutal job. And I think the history of mining communities, the women have had to be tough because the men have got these brutal jobs and hard jobs, dangerous jobs, often very unhealthy jobs as well, risking their lives every day, a lot of stress. So the women are pretty tough. And the women just turned on the men and said, these people want to support us and we need that support. What are you laughing at? What's funny about this? Maybe they've been monstered in the same way that we've been monstered in the news and in the British press. Don't you think it would be right to meet them and to find out what they're really like? So we were extended an invitation along with all the other support groups around the country that supported that particular community. And all the mining communities would every few months hold a weekend where they get the supporters to come down and stay in their community for the weekend, just to see how they were getting on, see what they're doing with the money that we were raising, see what problems we're having. And of course, it's pre-internet, pre-mobile phones. We didn't have 24-hour news channels. And I mean, the BBC was just, as it still is, just completely dishonest and right-wing. So
they were too busy hiding Jimmy Savile's secrets.
Meeting one-to-one was actually a chance for us to actually get the news straight from their mouths, because otherwise you weren't getting that direct news. So we went down on that first visit. We were the biggest group that weekend. There were 27 of us, not the 8 portrayed in the movie. So we were a very conspicuous group. The other groups that were there were some Nowgo trade unionists, which is now Unison. There were Fleet Street print worker trade unionists there. There were some SWP people there. But we walked into that Miners Welfare Club on the Sunday night. It was packed, 200 or 300 people in there. They were on strike, so they couldn't afford babysitters. So there were kids running around, grandmas and granddads. 27 young LGBT people from London walk in. Well, it's a bit kind of like, whoa. And the whole tenor of the conversations dropped, and we knew that was a direct response to our presence. But for a split second, we didn't know which way it was going to go. And then somebody started clapping, and the whole 200 to 300 people stood up and gave us a standing ovation. And we knew right then that history was being changed, but none of us expected such a reception, because they'd worked it out. They'd had their own discussions, so that by the time we got there, they saw us for what they were. And that applause, I think, was them saying, it's brave of you to do this. We know what you're doing. You are our kind, your family.
Yeah.
And well, by the end of the night, alcohol having lubricated conversations, all kinds of personal questions were being asked, and sexual tips exchanged and things like that. Do you know what I mean? I mean, what's the point in knowing about gay men if you don't pick up some tips? I'm sure some of the miners' wives, the younger miners' wives, looking at their husband as if say, yeah, well, we should try that. I certainly remember somebody asking, one woman asking what a cock ring was. and she looked at her husband across the table, and there was a kind of look of, we should try that.
Oh my God.
There you go.
Fantastic.
So we have our uses, you see. But honestly, that Sunday night when we were driving back to London, we were on fire. We were writing press reports. I mean, what fantastic press release! Do you know what I mean? That we got a standing ovation. So of course our collections just went woof. You know, people who had been cynical up to that point were just saying, "Wow, you really have got the miners to listen to us." And then, of course, famously, 12 months later, the 1985 Gay Pride March, the miners actually came to London, and we led the Gay Pride March, and that was the second best moment in my life. The first bit was walking into that Ontloy Miners Welfare Hall and getting that reception.
But the idea, and I think it's even sort of quoted in the film, but the idea of that practical solidarity, and that idea that you've got a friend that you never knew you had, and that is solidarity. That is the idea of solidarity, and the idea that it then reciprocated. It's just perfectly illustrates what solidarity is all about, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a good education film, isn't it, for the Labour movement?
Absolutely. And we've run out of time here, Mike, but it's been absolutely fantastic having you and hearing some of these stories firsthand. Because I think, again, it's no exaggeration to say that the LGSM and what you did there, I think probably moved forward the LGBT rights with the Labour Party especially, probably a good decade, and especially with the trade union movement. I think you've certainly inspired a lot of the trade union reps that I've showed that film to in your story. And thank you from all of us here and all of our listeners, I'm sure. So what's left, I think we need to look at the past, learn from what we've done in the past, and realise that if these things can be done once, they can be done again, and we've got to keep going. And we can't quit, because if we quit, we've lost. So as Bob Crow said, we've got to keep fighting. So thank you, everyone, and good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank
Bye.
you.